this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed to my beloved daughter.
Britain expected another ordinary palace announcement. Instead, King Charles placed his signature beneath a law that altered the future of the crown. The document did not remove Prince William from succession. It strengthened his path and formally established William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, as the monarchy's future ruling partnership. One stroke of a pen settled years of uncertainty, stunned the nation, and forced every royal household to confront a future that had suddenly become official. Charles sat alone after his advisors withdrew, the page beneath his hand. He read the last paragraph twice, tightened his grip around the pen, and stopped. The Royal Succession and Crown Continuity Act, the fictional law explaining how authority would pass safely from one reign to the next, did more than confirm William as the future king. It placed Catherine beside him as the future queen and opened confidential briefings, crown decisions, and emergency planning to them before the throne changed hands. Britain would no longer depend on tradition alone during a crisis, yet the king was also preparing the institution for a day when he would no longer lead it. Queen Camilla watched from across the room and kept her face still. She understood the meaning before the ink touched the paper. William and Catherine would become the institutional center of palace life while the current queen's influence narrowed. The monarch signed, set the pen down, and said nothing. His decision secured the future while acknowledging the ending waiting ahead. The king rejected a routine palace statement. He ordered a televised national address, allowing the sovereign to speak directly to the country because ordinary language could not carry this decision. Staff moved quickly, but Charles gave one command. William must receive the sealed document before the public hears anything. William opened the envelope beside Catherine. He read the clause naming their expanded duties, then placed his hand over hers. The prince felt the honor, but the cost quickly followed. Their time as parents, partners, and individuals had suddenly become smaller. Catherine met his eyes without speaking, and he understood the fear beneath her. The crown had not arrived, yet its shadow had entered their home. Then the telephone rang. Charles wanted his son at the palace immediately with no aides, secretaries, or witnesses, but before father and son could meet behind closed doors, William and Catherine had to absorb what the king's signature had taken from them and what it had placed upon their shoulders. To the public, William and Catherine appeared prepared for this moment from the day they married. Behind palace walls, the truth was far more painful. The new law did not simply promise them a crown in the future. It accelerated their transformation from parents and senior royals into the central figures of the monarchy. Every decision, every absence, and every private fear would now carry consequences for the institution itself. Catherine sat with the document open before her while William remained close, unable to escape the weight of what his father had set in motion. He was no longer only the heir waiting for a distant day. He had become an active constitutional partner, meaning he would now share responsibility for state matters, emergency planning, and decisions once kept almost entirely within the sovereign's control. That change placed real power in his hands before he became king, while removing the last safe distance between his family and the throne. Catherine read the same page again and asked what it would mean for George, Charlotte, and Louis. Her voice stayed calm, but her fear was clear. The Princess of Wales was no longer being treated only as a supportive royal figure. She was being prepared as the future queen, and her judgment and ability to protect the family would shape the next reign. William admitted that he had always known the crown would come, but he had never imagined Charles would formalize the transition while still carrying the visible burden of kingship. He felt honored by the trust, frightened by the speed, and strangely disloyal for accepting greater authority while his father still ruled. Catherine reached for his hand, but the next clause made them both pause. The law granted them access to weekly sovereign briefings, national continuity files, and confidential plans for the future structure of the royal household, the network of staff and offices that supports the monarch and the working royal family. Then she noticed the phrase repeated throughout the document: joint continuity leadership. Charles was not simply training his son to reign. The king was making Catherine essential to the survival of the monarchy, ensuring that William would never stand alone when pressure closed around him. The prince shut the folder and looked at her with sudden certainty. A law this bold could not have appeared without a crisis. Somewhere in the recent past, his father had witnessed something serious enough to end the old habit of leaving succession to tradition and hope. The answer lay in a private royal ceremony months earlier, a moment that would later be seen as the true point of no return. The law did not begin in Parliament, nor at the king's desk. Its true origin was a ceremony the public barely noticed. During a private investiture at Windsor Castle, a sudden breakdown in royal coordination exposed how dangerously dependent the monarchy had become on one aging sovereign. What happened inside that room unsettled Charles, tested William, and convinced the king that the future could no longer be left to tradition alone. Months earlier, Charles had gathered senior military representatives, Commonwealth officials, and members of the royal household for a private Windsor investiture. An investiture is a formal ceremony where the monarch presents honors, medals, or official appointments. William and Catherine attended because several long-term royal patronages were expected to pass to them one day, yet neither had any written authority to step in if the monarch suddenly could not continue. That weakness had remained hidden for years. Then Charles stopped. Midway through the official order, the king lost his place and fell silent. An equerry, a senior royal aide responsible for helping the sovereign during formal duties, moved forward, but William crossed the room first. The prince placed a steady hand near his father's arm, guided him toward a chair, and completed the remaining presentations with Catherine beside him. She followed the order without hesitation, calming the room while officials waited for someone to take control. Charles recovered, but the damage had already reached deeper than embarrassment. Behind a closed door later, he told William that the intervention had been necessary. Every word carried the pain of a father who had been seen kneading his son before the entire room. The future king refused to call it weakness. He told Charles that the real danger came from a system that expected the heir to act in a crisis while giving him no clear legal power to do so. Catherine then explained what she had noticed. Several officials had frozen because no written transition mechanism existed, meaning there was no agreed process for who should lead during a sudden interruption. For nearly 3 minutes, the ceremony, government protocol, and royal command had no undisputed center. The king listened without answering, but that night he requested every file on regency, succession, continuity, and the constitutional authority of the Prince of Wales. A regency is the legal arrangement used when a monarch cannot perform royal duties, while succession determines who inherits the crown. Those documents became the foundation of the new law. Yet one person resisted the proposal from the beginning, and that resistance would soon explode inside the family itself. The Windsor incident created the law, but the confrontation that followed would reveal who feared the future and who was prepared to fight for control of it. The confrontation took place without cameras, applause, or ceremonial smiles. Charles gathered William, Catherine, and Camilla in a private drawing room and placed the draft law on the table between them. No advisor spoke for them. No courtier softened the language. For the first time, the 4 people closest to the throne had to confront what the succession truly meant and who would lose influence once the future became legally protected. Charles opened the folder and told them the law would not end his authority. The king would remain sovereign, but the proposed structure would allow William and Catherine to act immediately during illness, emergency, or constitutional disruption. A constitutional disruption means a crisis that interrupts the normal exercise of royal and state duties. That mattered because the Windsor incident had exposed a dangerous delay between responsibility and legal power. William listened without interruption, knowing his father was offering unprecedented trust while binding him to duties he could no longer postpone. Camilla finally asked whether the law would reduce the role of the current queen. Her tone remained measured, but Catherine heard the fear beneath it. Once the future couple received formal authority, the center of palace influence would shift, and the queen consort understood exactly what that meant for her own place beside Charles. Catherine answered carefully. She said the law was not designed to replace anyone, only to prevent confusion when the country needed immediate leadership. Camilla pushed back. She warned that institutions often use the word continuity when they truly meant a transfer of power. The room tightened around that sentence. Charles placed both palms on the table and told her the decision was his. William watched the monarch choose the future of the crown over peace inside his own family, while Catherine remained still beside him. Then Charles revealed that Windsor had not been the only warning. Government advisors had delivered a constitutional assessment showing that the existing succession arrangements contained dangerous delays during a sudden national emergency. William asked whether the proposal had already been approved in principle. His father looked directly at him and answered that the final legal process had begun. This was not a consultation, it was a notification. Camilla rose before the discussion ended. She looked at Charles once, then left without another word, and the closing door carried more force than any argument. The king waited until she was gone before turning back to William and Catherine. Opposition inside the palace, he said, would be nothing compared with the political resistance waiting beyond it. The family had spoken from emotion, but the next battle would be fought through constitutional authority, legal wording, and the machinery that decides how much power a future king may hold. A royal signature can appear absolute, but no modern monarch changes succession alone. Behind Charles's decision stood constitutional lawyers, government ministers, Commonwealth consultations, and one haunting question. What would happen if the crown faced a sudden crisis before William had the legal power to respond? The king's boldest act was not taking control. It was persuading the entire system that delay had become more dangerous than change. Charles entered a late-night briefing with the final draft waiting before him and the weight of decades pressing against every line. Constitutional advisors had worked with senior ministers and representatives from the realms that shared the monarch, ensuring the new succession framework could not be dismissed as a private family arrangement. Those realms are countries that recognize the same sovereign as head of state, meaning the decision had to carry trust far beyond Britain. William would remain the heir, but he would gain defined continuity powers, while Catherine would receive a protected advisory and public leadership role tied directly to the future reign. One lawyer asked whether the clause involving Catherine should be weakened to avoid political resistance. The king removed his glasses, looked down at the page, and answered that William must never carry the monarchy alone. That sentence settled the argument, but it deepened his private pain. Charles had waited most of his life to become sovereign, yet the law most closely linked to his reign might be remembered for preparing the country to move beyond him. William felt that same tension from the opposite side. He feared that accepting expanded authority would make him appear impatient, as though he were reaching toward a throne his father still occupied. Catherine challenged that fear. She told the prince that refusing out of guilt would leave the country exposed and reduce the meaning of Charles's sacrifice. The final document contained an emergency provision allowing William to assume designated crown functions if temporary incapacity interrupted the king's work. Designated crown functions are specific royal duties legally assigned during a crisis, preventing confusion over who may act and when. A confidential schedule went even further. It reorganized planning teams, communication staff, and national programs around William and Catherine, quietly building the structure of the future court before the next reign began. Once Charles signed, sealed instructions moved through the palace within hours. Offices shifted, staff reported to new chains of command. Familiar access disappeared. Then one senior royal entered a private room and discovered that a privilege long taken for granted had vanished without warning. The legal argument had been won quietly, but the human cost became visible the moment palace doors opened and everyone learned where the new center of royal power now stood. The law was barely public before the palace began to change. Offices were reassigned, briefing routes were altered. Invitations that once required the king's direct approval began passing through William's team. Catherine received files previously withheld from every consort in waiting. To the nation, the announcement sounded like preparation. Inside the royal household, it felt like an invisible line had been drawn, and everyone immediately knew which side of the future they occupied. William's office gained authority over long-term state ceremonies, Commonwealth visits, and emergency royal representation, giving the prince practical control over duties that could shape Britain's response during a crisis. Commonwealth visits are official engagements with nations connected through a shared historical and political association, making their management central to the crown's global role. Catherine also received a permanent place in continuity meetings covering family welfare, patronage strategy, and the public responsibilities of the next generation. Her presence mattered because the future queen would no longer be briefed after decisions were made. She would help shape them. Camilla entered her private office expecting the usual red briefing box on the table. The box, used to carry confidential government and royal papers, was missing. An aide explained that the material had been redirected under the new arrangements. The queen stared at the empty space, then dismissed him with controlled politeness. She did not raise her voice, but the loss cut deeply. Camilla had helped Charles steady the monarchy through years of pressure, and now the institution was learning to function without her. Worse, the king had personally approved every change. William understood the pain spreading through the family, yet he refused to ask for the law to be softened. The future king knew that partial authority would revive the same dangerous uncertainty exposed at Windsor. Catherine faced a different wound, A confidential family file explained how George would gradually enter constitutional training. She read the first page, then closed it. The crown was already shaping her son's future years before he could understand what that future would demand. Charles soon canceled a planned public appearance after receiving the first opinion polls. Support for the law was overwhelming, but the result brought little relief. The monarch summoned William to Buckingham Palace and ordered every official to leave the room. The prince expected a political discussion. Instead, his father waited until the doors closed and asked him to remain alone. The public success of the law could not settle the private wound between father and son, and their next conversation would determine whether this transition was an act of trust or a silent farewell. There were no ministers in the room, no legal papers between them, and no palace aide waiting to record the outcome. Charles and William stood alone as father and son, stripped of the titles that had controlled almost every conversation of their lives. The law had defined Britain's future in public. Now they had to decide what that future meant privately. Charles spoke first. He told William the law was not born from doubt in his ability to reign, but from a deeper fear that the monarchy had become too dependent on the health, strength, and presence of one person. The king believed continuity could no longer rest on tradition alone. Continuity, in this context, meant the clear transfer of royal duties during illness, emergency, or sudden crisis. William understood. The prince admitted that earlier generations had survived through custom and loyalty, but modern pressure demanded faster decisions, visible leadership, and a prepared partnership before uncertainty could spread. Charles poured 2 glasses of water rather than calling an aide. He handed one to his son, sat opposite him, and said signing the law had felt like writing the first sentence of his own departure. William looked at his father and answered with painful honesty. He did not want the crown if accepting it made Charles feel erased. The monarch held his gaze and replied that every sovereign eventually faced the same choice: protect the position for as long as possible, or protect what came after it. That answer cut through the tension. This was not surrender. It was sacrifice. William leaned forward as Charles asked for one promise. Catherine must never be treated as a ceremonial figure or left isolated by court politics. The king explained that he had insisted her name appear throughout the continuity framework because her steadiness would keep the future court from becoming cold and trapped by power. The future king said partnership had always been his intention. Now, he added, it would be his duty. Charles then revealed the deeper reason behind the law. It was also an attempt to correct the failures of earlier royal generations when spouses carried impossible burdens without protection, voice, or recognized authority. William finally understood his father was not only preparing him to rule, he was trying to prevent old wounds from being repeated. They left the room together, not as rivals separated by the throne, but as 2 men joined by the same burden. Outside the palace, however, the country had already turned their private agreement into something larger. Their private promise gave the law its emotional meaning, but Britain's streets, newspapers, and broadcasters would decide how history interpreted the king's extraordinary choice. By sunrise, the law was no longer a palace secret or a constitutional document. It belonged to the country. Every newspaper carried the same historic shift in different languages. Broadcasters abandoned ordinary schedules. Crowds gathered beneath royal balconies, even though no appearance had been announced. Britain was not mourning one reign or celebrating another. It was confronting something rarer, the sight of a monarch deliberately sharing the future before the crown demanded it. Charles remained king with full sovereign authority, but national broadcasters explained that the new law formally prepared William and Catherine to assume defined responsibilities before accession. Accession is the moment an heir legally becomes monarch, and the change meant the country would no longer face that moment with an untested future court. Constitutional commentators called the measure the clearest modern statement of royal continuity, stressing that it strengthened the established line of succession rather than bypassing it. One London newspaper captured the public mood with a full-width photograph of Charles signing the document beneath the headline, "The King Secures the Future." A smaller image showed William and Catherine leaving Kensington Palace together, their expressions controlled but heavy with meaning. Outside Buckingham Palace, Margaret, an elderly woman holding a small Union flag, spoke during a live broadcast. "He has given his son time to prepare, and that may be the kindest thing a king can do," she said. Her words spread quickly because they reached the emotional center of the moment. Some critics accused the palace of beginning William's reign too early, but support grew as the decision came to be seen not as surrender but as service. William then appeared beside Catherine in a televised message. He thanked his father for trusting them with responsibilities that would affect both the nation and their family. Catherine followed with a promise that they would meet the burden with humility, unity, and care. Her words carried calm, but the cost was clear. Their lives had become more public, their choices more limited, and their children more tightly bound to the crown. Charles watched the statement in private. When Catherine acknowledged his courage, the king lowered his head for a moment, moved by the fact that his sacrifice had finally been understood. That evening, Camilla, William, and Catherine prepared to appear together, where each person stood and would speak louder than legal language. The country had delivered its reaction, but one final image would settle the emotional truth of the moment. The final verdict did not come from a courtroom, a newspaper, or a palace statement. It came when Charles stepped forward before the nation with William and Catherine beside him. The king had not surrendered his crown. William had not seized it. Catherine had not been elevated through ambition. Together, they represented something the monarchy had often struggled to achieve, a transition built on preparation rather than panic, trust rather than rivalry, and acceptance rather than fear. Charles stood as the reigning sovereign, and nothing in the new law weakened his authority. The crown remained his. The government still recognized him as monarch, and every constitutional duty continued under his command. Yet William and Catherine now stood beside him as the recognized guardians of what came next. That mattered, because the monarchy had finally chosen preparation over uncertainty. Before the cameras began, Charles reached toward William and adjusted the position of his ceremonial insignia, a formal symbol showing rank and royal duty. The prince looked at his father, and the king answered with a small nod before stepping into place. No speech could have carried more meaning. The future king was not replacing him. He was being prepared by him. Camilla joined them with visible composure. The queen consort had been forced to confront the limits of her future influence, but she chose unity over resistance and stood beside Charles without protest. Catherine carried a different weight. She understood that the law had permanently changed her family's life, narrowing the freedom of her children and drawing every private choice closer to public duty. Yet she accepted the burden because Charles had given her what royal spouses had rarely received: real authority matched with real responsibility. William did not appear triumphant. He appeared ready. The prince had not rushed toward the throne, and Catherine had not been reduced to an accessory beside him. She had become a central force in the survival of the crown. The true meaning of the law was never that William would one day become king. Britain already knew that. Its historic importance was that Charles refused to leave the next reign unprepared, legally uncertain, or emotionally divided. The king's signature became the defining act of a sovereign who understood that power is measured not only by how firmly it is held, but by how wisely it is prepared for release. What do you think about this remarkable decision? Was it the right way to prepare the monarchy for the future, or would you have handled it differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal story. Thanks for watching.